In the beginning, there was only silence and the sound of water moving through time. The Alpheus River winds through the valley of Olympia like a silver thread sewn through green cloth, carrying with it the whispered secrets of champions whose names have long since dissolved into legend. Here, in this sacred hollow nestled between gentle hills in the western Peloponnese, morning mist clings to ancient olive groves like the breath of sleeping gods. The air itself seems heavy with memory, thick with the accumulated prayers and dreams of countless pilgrims who have walked these paths across millennia. Stand quietly in this valley at dawn, when the light first touches the scattered stones that once formed mighty temples, and you will understand why the ancients believed that certain places are chosen by the divine. There is something different about the quality of silence here, something that speaks to the deepest chambers of the human heart. The very earth seems to pulse with a rhythm older than civilization, a heartbeat that connects this moment to every moment that came before. What makes a place holy? Is it the accumulated weight of human devotion, the countless feet that have worn smooth the paths between sacred groves? Or do some valleys exist as natural temples, their geography itself an invitation to transcendence? The ancient Greeks understood that Olympia was both a place made sacred by human recognition of divinity that was already present in the flowing water, the sheltering hills, the olive trees whose roots drink from soil blessed by Zeus himself. These olive trees still grow here, their gnarled trunks twisted into shapes that seem to tell stories of their own. Their branches reach skyward with the patience of centuries, their silver-green leaves catching the morning light like fragments of ancient prayers made visible. Some of these trees may be descendants of the very groves that provided shade for the first Olympic competitors, their genetic memory stretching back through an unbroken chain of seasons to that mythical time when gods walked openly among mortals. The ruins speak in their own language, not the harsh voice of destruction, but the soft whisper of transformation. What humans built in stone and marble has returned gradually to the earth that gave it birth, but the essential spirit of this place remains untouched by time. Broken columns lie scattered like the bones of giants, yet each fragment still hums with the energy of the prayers once offered within these sacred walls. Archaeologists have spent lifetimes carefully excavating and cataloguing these remains, but the most important discoveries cannot be held in museums or described in scholarly papers. The mystery of Olympia lies not in what can be measured and weighed, but in what can only be felt by those who approach with hearts prepared for wonder. This is a place where the boundary between the mortal and divine realms grows thin, where human achievement becomes a form of prayer, where the simple act of running or wrestling or throwing a discus transforms into communion with forces greater than individual ambition. Listen carefully in the early morning hours, when the tour buses have not yet arrived and the only sounds are the river's ancient song and the wind moving through olive branches, and you may hear something extraordinary, the ghostly echo of crowds that gathered here when the world was young. 40,000 voices raised in wonder and celebration, the thunder of feet racing across sacred ground, the clash of athletic combat offered as sacrifice to watching gods. Who were these first athletes who answered the call of this valley? What drove them to leave the safety of their city walls and journey through dangerous territories to gather in this remote sanctuary? The written records that survive speak of names and victories, of stadion races won and olive crowns bestowed, but they cannot capture the deeper truth that something in the human spirit recognized this place as a natural theater for the drama of striving and transcendence. The first Olympic Games did not begin with a committee meeting or a royal decree. They emerged from the collective recognition that certain acts of human excellence deserve divine witness, that the gods themselves hunger for the spectacle of mortal creatures pushing beyond their limitations in pursuit of something that can only be called glory. This valley became the stage for that eternal drama, a natural amphitheatre where earth and sky conspire to frame moments of perfect human achievement. Even now, when the temples have crumbled and the stadium lies buried beneath centuries of accumulated earth, the essential magic persists. Modern visitors arrive as tourists, but often leave as pilgrims, touched by something they cannot quite name but will never completely forget. They have stood where legends were born, breathed air that once carried the prayers of heroes, walked on ground made sacred by the accumulated dreams of generations who understood that human excellence is itself a form of worship. The valley remembers everything, every foot race run, every wrestling match fought, every moment when a mortal athlete achieved something so perfect that it seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. This memory is not stored in stone or preserved in written accounts, but lives in the very atoms of this place, in the dance of light and shadow that plays across these hills, in the eternal conversation between the flowing river and the listening trees. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of Olympia, that a place can become so saturated with human aspiration and divine attention that it transcends its own physical limitations. The ancient stadium may be silent, the temples reduced to foundations, but the spiritual architecture of this valley remains intact, still calling to those who understand that true competition is not between athletes, but between the possible and the impossible, between what we are and what we might become. The morning mist begins to lift, revealing the scattered stones in clearer detail, but the mystery only deepens. For in this valley that remembers everything, we begin to understand that the first Olympic Games were not simply an ancient sporting event, but the birth of an idea so powerful that it would survive the fall of empires and the passage of millennia. Here, in this sacred hollow where the Alpheus River carries its eternal messages to the sea, humanity first discovered that the act of striving itself could be transformed into prayer, that competition could become communion, that in the pursuit of excellence, mortals might touch the realm of gods. Before the first footrace was run, before the first olive crown was placed upon a victor's brow, before the first recorded name entered the annals of Olympic history, there existed something far more profound than facts. There existed the realm of myth, where truth wears the flowing robes of story and speaks in the voice of gods and heroes. In that timeless space that exists before memory begins, when the world was young and the boundary between the possible and impossible had not yet hardened into the laws of physics, the origins of the Olympic Games shimmer like heat mirages on a summer road. The ancient Greeks themselves, those masters of reason and philosophy, could not agree on how their greatest festival began. Perhaps this disagreement was itself sacred, a recognition that some truths are too large to be contained within a single story. One telling whispers that it was Heracles himself, the greatest of heroes, who first marked out the sacred boundaries of the Olympic sanctuary. Having completed his 12 impossible labors, having descended to the underworld and returned, having wrestled with gods and emerged victorious, Heracles came to this valley bearing a burden heavier than any boulder he had ever lifted, the weight of his own divine nature trapped within mortal flesh. Here, in this place where earth and sky seemed to meet in perfect harmony, he established competitions that would allow other mortals to taste, however briefly, the divine fire that burned within his own breast. The storytellers say that Heracles himself paced out the length of the stadium, using his own enormous feet as the measure. 600 of his steps became the standard distance for the Footrace, forever linking the achievements of future champions to the stride of the greatest hero who ever lived. When he planted the first olive tree within the sacred grove, its roots immediately reached deep into the earth, seeking the underground streams that would nourish champions yet unborn. But older voices, speaking from the shadows of even more ancient memory, tell a different tale. They whisper of Pelops, the young prince whose name would eventually grace the entire peninsula, whose story carries the dark beauty of myth at its most profound. Pelops came to Olympia as a suitor, but what he sought was more precious than gold or kingdoms. He sought the hand of Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus. The king, warned by an oracle that his daughter's husband would cause his death, had devised a deadly contest for all suitors. They must race their chariots against his own divine horses, gifted by the war god Ares himself. If they won, they could claim Hippodamia as their bride. If they lost, they would forfeit their lives. The road from Olympia to the king's palace was lined with the skulls of princes who had dared to compete for love. But Pelops possessed something that the other suitors had lacked, not greater skill or faster horses, but the desperate cunning of a man who understood that love sometimes requires the willing embrace of destruction. He conspired with Myrtilus, the king's charioteer, bribing him to replace the bronze linchpins of the royal chariot with pins made of wax. As the race reached its climax, with Pelops and the king running wheel to wheel around the final turn, the wax melted under the strain, and Oenomaus was thrown to his death. Pelops won his bride, but the victory came wrapped in a curse that would haunt his lineage for generations. Some say that in his guilt and gratitude, he established the Olympic Games as a monument to the terrible power of love and the price that mortals pay when they dare to compete with the designs of fate itself. The chariot races that became a central feature of the later Olympics carried within them the echo of that first fateful race where love conquered death through treachery and transformation. Yet even these heroic tales may be mere echoes of something older and more mysterious. In the deepest caves of memory, where human consciousness touches the primal forces that shaped the earth itself, there are stories that speak of competitions that began before the first human foot touched this valley. The gods themselves, it is whispered, gathered here to contest with one another in displays of divine power that reshaped the very landscape. Zeus wrestled with his father Kronos for dominion over time itself, their struggle creating the hills that surround the sacred valley. Apollo raced against Hermes across the sky, their divine footsteps burning paths that became the constellation patterns that mark the seasons. Athena and Poseidon competed to see who could create the most perfect gift for humanity, their contest echoing through every Olympic competition that would follow. These divine games required no human witnesses, no olive crowns or victory songs. The gods competed for the pure joy of excellence, for the cosmic pleasure of testing divine limits against divine limits. But their contests created ripples in the fabric of reality itself, and this valley became a place where those ripples would always be felt most strongly. When mortals eventually came to compete here, they were unconsciously following patterns established by the gods themselves, participating in an eternal drama that had been playing out since the foundation of the world. The most mystical telling of all suggests that the Olympic Games were never truly established by any individual, divine, or mortal. Instead, they emerged naturally from the very nature of this place, the way that certain valleys will always sing in harmony with the wind, or certain springs will always run clear and cold regardless of the season. The Valley of Olympia, according to this understanding, is a place where the universe's own tendency toward competition and excellence becomes visible in physical form. Perhaps this is why the ancient Greeks could never agree on the origins of their games, because the truth was too vast and multi-layered to be captured in any single narrative. Every story they told was true in its own way, each myth revealing a different facet of the central mystery. Heracles brought divine strength, Pelops brought mortal passion, the gods brought cosmic significance, and the valley itself brought the eternal stage on which all dramas of human striving would unfold. In this realm of mystical uncertainty, where facts dissolve into legend and legend reveals truth more profound than any historical record, we begin to understand that the Olympic Games were not invented but discovered. They existed as potential in the very structure of reality, waiting for the right moment, the right place, the right combination of human need and divine attention to manifest in the world of form and time. The mists of prehistory may never fully lift, and perhaps they should not. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, not because the truth is hidden, but because the truth is so magnificent that it can only be approached through the poetry of myth, the wisdom of uncertainty, and the recognition that the greatest human achievements often spring from sources too deep for the mind to fathom, but not too deep for the heart to recognize. In a world where war was the natural state of existence, where city-states lived in constant readiness for battle, where the clash of bronze weapons provided the rhythmic soundtrack to daily life, something impossible happened. Every 4 years, peace descended upon the Greek world like morning light. City by city, island by island, until the entire Mediterranean basin lay wrapped in a silence more profound than any victory song. This was the Ikakeria, the sacred truce, and it represented perhaps the greatest miracle in the ancient world, not because it stopped individual conflicts, but because it proved that human beings possessed within themselves the capacity to choose peace over the endless cycle of revenge and conquest that had defined their existence since the first tribe took up arms against its neighbors. The truce did not begin with armies laying down their weapons. It began with a single voice calling out across the agora of a distant city, carried by heralds who traveled the dangerous roads with nothing to protect them but the sacred nature of their message. These heralds, known as spondophoroi, were not soldiers or diplomats or kings. They were ordinary men transformed by their mission into something extraordinary, their bodies made inviolate by the divine command they carried. Picture these messengers as they set out from Olympia 3 months before each festival, carrying nothing but olive branches and bronze tablets inscribed with the sacred proclamation. They moved like points of light, spreading across the map of the ancient world, each one a walking embodiment of the impossible possibility that war could simply stop, not through conquest or surrender or negotiation, but through collective recognition that some things are more important than the human compulsion to destroy. The bronze tablets they carried were inscribed with words that had the power to transform reality itself. Let all who hear this message know that Zeus, King of gods, has commanded peace to reign throughout his sacred festival. Let no army march, let no city attack its neighbor, let no weapon be raised in anger, for the space of 3 months while mortals gather to honor the divine through competition of excellence rather than destruction. The first herald would arrive at a city's gates like a man bearing news of victory, but the victory he announced belonged to no single people. He proclaimed that humanity itself had won a battle against its own darkest impulses, that for a brief, shining moment, the better angels of human nature would be allowed to prevail over the demons of tribal hatred and territorial ambition. The response was rarely immediate acceptance. City elders would gather, armies would pause in their preparations, kings would consult their advisors and their gods. How could they trust their enemies to honor such a truce? How could they leave their borders undefended while traditional rivals received the same message? The practical mind rebels against such idealistic thinking. Surely someone would break the peace. Surely this was all an elaborate trap designed to benefit whichever side was clever enough to violate the sacred agreement. But something deeper than practicality was at work in these moments. The herald did not argue or negotiate or offer political incentives. He simply delivered his message and waited, trusting in the power of the divine command to work its own transformation in the hearts of those who heard it. And one by one, like individual flames being lit from a single torch, the cities began to accept the sacred truce. The acceptance often came with tears. Hardened warriors who had spent their lives preparing for battle suddenly found themselves confronted with the possibility of something they had never dared to imagine, a world without war, however brief. Mothers who had sent sons off to campaigns that might never end received word that for 3 months at least, no new graves would be dug. Children playing at war in the dusty streets learned that their games were more real than the conflicts that had shaped their parents' lives. As the news spread, a transformation began that touched every aspect of Greek society. Merchants who had spent years calculating the safest routes between hostile territories suddenly found every road open to them. Pirates, those scourges of the Mediterranean, abandoned their raids not out of fear of punishment, but out of respect for the divine will that commanded peace. Ships that had sailed in armed convoys began to trust the protection of the sacred truce more than they trusted bronze-pointed spears. The truce was enforced not by armies or threats of retribution, but by something far more powerful, the collective understanding that to break it was to invite divine wrath upon one's entire people. Zeus himself was said to watch from Olympus, taking personal note of any violation of his sacred peace. The gods who might overlook individual crimes or political machinations would not tolerate any interference with their festival. The price of breaking the Olympic truce was not defeat in battle, but cosmic disfavor, the kind of punishment that could blight crops, spoil victories, and bring misfortune for generations. This divine enforcement proved remarkably effective. There are records of cities that attempted to violate the truce, facing such immediate and overwhelming catastrophes that their neighbors required no further evidence of divine disapproval. An earthquake that struck just as troops began to march, a plague that appeared overnight in an army camp, a defeat so complete and inexplicable that it could only be attributed to supernatural intervention. These became powerful reminders that some laws transcend human authority. But the truce represented more than divine command, backed by cosmic punishment. It offered proof that human beings possessed within themselves the capacity for something that seemed to contradict their fundamental nature. For 3 months out of every 4 years, the Greeks created a world that functioned according to different principles than those that governed ordinary time. Competition replaced conquest, excellence superseded domination, and the pursuit of glory became a collaborative rather than destructive enterprise. The empty battlefields left in the wake of the herald's passage became monuments to the possibility of peace. Wind moved through abandoned siege engines, grass grew over hastily dug fortifications, and weapons left to rust in their racks became offerings to a different understanding of human potential. These temporary landscapes of peace served as prophecies of what the world might become if human beings could learn to channel their competitive instincts into forms that created rather than destroyed. The sacred truce also revealed the profound religious dimensions of Greek athletic competition. This was not merely a political agreement designed to ensure safe passage for athletes and spectators. It was a recognition that the Olympic Games served a cosmic function that superseded human conflict. The gods required their festival to proceed uninterrupted by mortal warfare because it served purposes beyond human understanding, purposes connected to the fundamental order of the universe itself. As the 3 months of peace drew to a close and armies began to reassemble, veterans of multiple Olympic truces spoke of the strange melancholy that accompanied the return to normal warfare. They had tasted a different world, one where human energy was directed towards celebrating excellence rather than creating destruction. The memory of that peace would haunt them through future campaigns, a persistent whisper suggesting that the world they accepted as inevitable was actually just one choice among many. The sacred truce stands as one of humanity's earliest recognitions that competition and warfare, while similar in their intensity and passion, serve entirely different masters. Competition seeks to create excellence. Warfare seeks to eliminate opposition. Competition honors the defeated as well as the victorious. Warfare denies the humanity of the enemy. Competition creates stories that inspire future generations. Warfare creates graveyards that father future conflicts. In commanding peace for his Olympic festival, Zeus was not simply ensuring safe passage for athletes and spectators. He was demonstrating that human beings possessed within themselves the capacity to choose transcendence over destruction, to recognize that their highest achievements came not from their ability to destroy their enemies, but from their willingness to honor the divine spark that exists in every competitor who dares to strive for excellence. The sacred truce descends upon us still in every moment when we choose to see our rivals as collaborators in the pursuit of greatness rather than obstacles to be eliminated. The herald's message echoes across millennia, reminding us that peace is not the absence of competition, but the transformation of competition into its highest form, a sacred contest where victory belongs to excellence itself and defeat becomes another name for the courage to try. The roads of ancient Greece had witnessed countless armies, countless merchants, countless messengers carrying news of war and peace across the scattered city-states of the Mediterranean world. But every 4 years, these same dusty pathways became arteries of pilgrimage, carrying a different kind of cargo toward a single sacred destination. Men whose hearts burned with something that transcended the ordinary concerns of commerce and conquest. They came from everywhere. The Greek tongue was spoken and beyond. From the marble cities of Ionia, where philosophy was born, from the rugged mountains of Macedonia, where kings bred horses faster than the wind, from the sun-baked islands of the Aegean, where fishermen sang ancient songs to guide their nets through waters blue as eternity. They came from Syracuse in Sicily and Cyrene in North Africa, from Byzantium on the edge of the unknown world, and Massalia, where the Mediterranean kissed foreign shores. The pilgrimage began not with a single step, but with a single moment of recognition, the realization that something called to them from that sacred valley in the Peloponnese, something that promised transformation for those brave enough to answer its summons. Some were athletes whose bodies had been sculpted into instruments of divine glory. Others were spectators drawn by curiosity or devotion, or simply the human need to witness greatness. But all carried within themselves the same essential cargo, hope that they might encounter something in Olympia that would change them forever. The aristocrats traveled in horse-drawn chariots, their wealth displayed in the quality of their equipment and the number of servants who attended them. These were men accustomed to comfort and deference, yet many chose to walk the final stages of their journey, understanding that something about the act of pilgrimage required the humility of sore feet and dusty clothes. Their conversations as they traveled revealed the deeper motivations that drove even the privileged to undertake such journeys, not entertainment or social obligation, but genuine spiritual hunger. Behind them came the athletes themselves, traveling light and lean, their possessions reduced to the essentials of competition and survival. These men had already sacrificed everything to their pursuit of athletic excellence, wealth, comfort, the easy pleasures that ordinary mortals use to fill their days. Now they carried their bodies toward Olympia like living offerings, understanding that they were not merely competitors, but participants in a sacred drama that had been unfolding since the gods first walked among mortals. The most touching pilgrims were perhaps the ordinary citizens who possessed no special athletic gifts, but felt called, nonetheless, to witness the Olympic festival. Farmers left their fields in the care of neighbors, craftsmen closed their workshops, teachers dismissed their students, all trusting that the urgency they felt to reach Olympia justified the risks and sacrifices involved in the journey. Many would spend their life savings on this single trip, understanding instinctively that some experiences are worth any price. As the roads converged, like rivers flowing toward the sea, the separate streams of pilgrims began to merge into something larger than the sum of their individual purposes. Conversations sparked between strangers who might never have spoken in their home cities, Athenian philosophers debating with Spartan warriors, Corinthian merchants sharing bread with Rhodian sailors. The journey itself became a democracy of aspiration, where social distinctions mattered less than the shared recognition that they were all participating in something sacred. The transformation that occurred during these journeys was as important as any competition that would take place in the sacred grove. Men who had spent their lives defined by their city's walls, their family's status, their profession's limitations, discovered that they possessed other identities. Pilgrim, seeker, witness to the divine. The further they traveled from home, the more their everyday selves fell away, replaced by something more essential and more connected to the cosmic purposes that the Olympic Games served. The dangers of ancient travel intensified the spiritual dimensions of the Olympic pilgrimage. Bandits haunted the mountain passes, pirates cruised the coastal waters, and the ever-present possibility of warfare meant that any journey might end in capture or death. Yet the sacred truce created a bubble of protection around the Olympic pilgrims that seemed to extend beyond legal guarantees into the realm of the miraculous. Stories spread of bandits who encountered Olympic travelers and found themselves unable to complete their attacks, of storms that parted around ships carrying athletes to the games, of wild animals that seemed to recognize the sacred nature of those who traveled under Zeus's protection. The physical hardships of the journey served their own spiritual purpose. Blistered feet and aching muscles, nights spent sleeping under stars, and days spent walking through dust and heat. These discomforts stripped away the cushioning of civilized life and revealed the essential human being beneath. By the time they reached Olympia, the pilgrims had been purified not by ritual, but by the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other for hundreds of miles, trusting that their destination would prove worthy of their suffering. The conversations that developed during these extended journeys created bonds that transcended the normal divisions of Greek society. Rivals discovered unexpected friendships, traditional enemies found common ground in their shared pilgrimage, and all began to understand that the Olympic Games served a purpose larger than any individual city's interests. The festival belonged not to any particular people, but to all Greeks, and indeed to all humans who recognized the divine spark that competition could kindle in mortal hearts. As they drew closer to Olympia, the anticipation became almost unbearable. The landscape itself began to change, taking on the quality of consecrated ground. Trees seemed greener, water tasted sweeter, and even the light appeared different, cleaner somehow, more transparent, as if the proximity to sacred space was already beginning to work its transformation on their perception of reality. The first glimpse of the sacred grove often brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened travelers. After weeks of dusty roads and uncertain accommodations, after nights of sleeping under foreign stars and days of walking through landscapes that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon, they finally saw it. The olive trees of Olympia rising like green smoke from the valley floor, the temple roofs gleaming in the distance like promises made manifest in marble and bronze. The final approach became a procession of wonder. Pilgrims who had maintained the steady pace of experienced travelers for hundreds of miles suddenly found themselves slowing, savoring each step that brought them closer to their destination. Conversations that had filled the daylight hours on the road fell into respectful silence. Even the animals seemed to sense that they were approaching something extraordinary. Horses lifted their heads with alert interest, dogs stopped their constant investigating of roadside scents, and birds gathered in the trees as if to serve as witnesses to this convergence of human aspiration. The moment of arrival carried with it the weight of fulfilled prophecy. These men had answered a call they couldn't fully explain, had traveled distances that challenged the limits of ancient transportation, had placed their trust in divine protection and human possibility. Now they stood at the gates of the sacred precinct, transformed by their journey from ordinary citizens of scattered city-states into something larger, pilgrims in service to an ideal that transcended the boundaries of individual ambition. But the transformation was not complete. The journey had prepared them, purified them, brought them into the proper state of receptivity for what lay ahead. Now came the true test. Would they prove worthy of the sacred drama they had traveled so far to witness? Would their presence add to the spiritual significance of the Olympic festival? Or would they remain merely spectators to greatness they could observe but not share? The sacred grove awaited their answer, patient as it had been patient for centuries, ready to welcome those who approached with proper reverence and proper understanding of what they were about to experience. The pilgrimage was ending, but the true Olympic experience was just beginning, and that experience would determine whether they returned home merely as travelers who had seen remarkable sights, or as men forever changed by their encounter with the divine spark that burns at the heart of all true competition. Their transformation from separate individuals into a community of witnesses was now complete. The roads that had brought them here as strangers would carry them home as members of an eternal brotherhood. Those who had stood in the sacred grove when gods walked among mortals, who had witnessed the impossible made manifest in human flesh and will and divine grace. Before any mortal foot could touch the sacred track, before any muscle could strain toward Olympic glory, before any crown of olive could rest upon a champion's brow, the gods required their due. The great altar of Zeus stood at the heart of the sacred precinct, like a mountain built from the accumulated devotion of centuries, its base formed from the ashes of countless sacrifices offered by generations who understood that divine favor could not be assumed but must be earned through blood and fire and perfect submission to the cosmic order. This was no ordinary altar carved from marble or built from stone. The altar of Zeus at Olympia had grown over time like a living thing, each Olympic festival adding another layer to its sacred bulk as the ashes of sacrificed animals were mixed with the dust of the sanctuary and molded into an ever-expanding monument to divine hunger. By the time of the classical games, it towered nearly 22 feet into the air, its irregular surface scarred and blackened by centuries of fire, its very substance composed of the transformed remnants of thousands of offerings made by pilgrims who understood that approach to the divine required sacrifice of the most precious things mortals possessed. The awakening of the altar began 3 days before the first competition, when the sacred fire was kindled not by human hands but by the pure light of the sun itself, focused through polished bronze mirrors until it ignited the carefully prepared tinder of aromatic woods and sacred herbs. This was no mere practical matter of starting a cooking fire. This was the moment when the earthly realm opened its communication with Olympus, when the boundary between mortal and divine grew thin enough for prayers to pass through and blessings to descend. The smoke that rose from the first lighting carried with it the accumulated hopes and fears of every pilgrim who had journeyed to witness the games. Thick and white and sweet with the scent of frankincense and myrrh, it climbed straight into the windless morning air like a visible prayer, creating a column that connected the sacred grove to the heavens where Zeus sat in judgment upon all mortal endeavors. Those who witnessed this first kindling often spoke of feeling the presence of divine attention settling upon the sanctuary like an almost physical weight. The priests who tended the altar were not ordinary servants of the temple, but men whose entire lives had been dedicated to understanding the precise requirements of divine protocol. They knew which woods burned with flames that pleased the gods, which combinations of incense carried prayers most effectively to Olympus, which animals offered the perfect balance of value and purity that divine justice demanded. Their movements around the altar followed patterns passed down through generations, each gesture refined through centuries of practice, until the entire ritual achieved the perfection that gods required from mortal worship. The selection of the sacrificial animals began weeks before the games, as priests examined the herds and flocks of the surrounding countryside for beasts that met the exacting standards of Olympic sacrifice. The chosen animals had to be perfect specimens, unmarked by disease or injury, untainted by contact with anything impure, and possessed of that indefinable quality that marked them as suitable offerings to the King of Gods. The farmers who raised these perfect creatures understood that they were participating in something far more significant than commerce. They were providing the raw materials for communion between earth and heaven. As the festival approached, the selected animals were brought to the sanctuary in solemn procession, garlanded with flowers and ribbons, as if they were victorious athletes rather than destined sacrifices. The oxen chosen for Zeus himself were magnificent beasts, their horns gilded, their hides brushed until they gleamed like polished bronze, their very presence a testament to mortal recognition of divine majesty. These were not random animals selected for their meat value, but carefully chosen participants in a cosmic drama where their deaths would serve purposes beyond human understanding. The moment of sacrifice came with the first rays of dawn on the opening day of the games, when 100 perfect oxen were led to the altar in a procession that included every important participant in the Olympic festival. Athletes who would compete for glory, spectators who had traveled from distant lands, priests who served as intermediaries between mortal and divine realms, all understood that they were witnessing not merely a religious ceremony, but a necessary act of cosmic maintenance. The killing itself was performed with ritual precision that transformed violence into sacrament. Each animal was led to the altar individually, its head lifted toward the sky so that its eyes might look once upon the realm of the gods before its life flowed out in crimson offering. The priests who wielded the sacred knives had trained for years to ensure that each death came swiftly and cleanly without unnecessary suffering that might offend divine sensibilities. The blood that poured onto the altar's ancient stones was not waste, but the most precious gift that mortals could offer, the life force itself, freely given in recognition of divine sovereignty. But the blood was only the beginning. The bodies of the sacrificed animals were carefully butchered according to ancient protocols, with specific portions reserved for the gods and others designated for the human participants in the festival. The divine portions, the fat, the bones, the organs that ancient wisdom associated with the seat of life were burned upon the altar until they were completely consumed, their essence carried to Olympus in the smoke that rose from the sacred fire. The transformation was visible to all who witnessed it. What had been solid flesh became ethereal smoke. What had been earthly substance became heavenly offering. The priests who tended this transformation spoke of feeling the moment when the gods accepted each sacrifice, a subtle shift in the quality of the fire, a change in the direction of the smoke that indicated divine satisfaction with the offering presented. The athletes themselves participated directly in this opening sacrifice, understanding that their own future performances depended upon divine approval earned through proper observance of ritual requirements. They approached the altar not as spectators, but as participants, offering their own prayers and promises while the blood of the oxen soaked into ground that would soon witness their own struggles for immortal glory. Many would later speak of feeling a direct connection between the sacrifice they witnessed and the superhuman performances they achieved in competition, as if the gods who received the blood offering repaid the gift with temporary access to divine strength and skill. The feeding of the sacred fire continued throughout the 5 days of the festival, creating a constant column of smoke that served as a visible reminder of divine presence among the mortal competitors. Additional sacrifices were offered after each day's competitions, with portions of the daily offerings reserved for the specific gods who governed each athletic discipline. Hermes received offerings before the foot races, Apollo before the musical competitions, Ares before the combat sports, each deity honored according to their particular interests and powers. The altar itself seemed to grow more alive as the festival progressed, its ancient stones warmed by constant fire, its scarred surface gleaming with fresh blood and burning fat. Pilgrims who approached to offer their personal prayers often reported feeling heat radiating from the altar that had nothing to do with the physical fire, as if the accumulated devotion of centuries had kindled a spiritual flame that burned independently of any earthly fuel. By the final day of the games, when the last competitions had been completed and the final victors crowned, the altar stood as a monument to successful communion between mortal and divine realms. The gods had received their due, the athletes had competed under divine protection, and the cosmic order had been maintained through proper observance of the rituals that connected earth to heaven. The extinguishing of the sacred fire marked the end of the Olympic festival, but the altar itself remained alive with accumulated power, its substance enriched by fresh offerings, its connection to the divine realm strengthened by another successful festival. Until the next Olympics, it would stand as a sleeping giant in the sacred grove, patient and powerful, waiting for the moment when mortal need would again require the awakening of its terrible and wonderful connection to the gods who watched over all human striving toward excellence. In the deep blue hour before dawn, when the sacred fires still burned, But the morning light had not yet touched the olive groves. The Olympic Stadium lay in perfect silence, not the empty silence of abandonment, but the pregnant quiet of a space holding its breath, waiting for the transformation that would soon fill its humble boundaries with the most intense concentration of human aspiration the ancient world had ever known. This was not a stadium as the modern mind imagines such places. No soaring architecture of steel and concrete, no complex engineering designed to awe spectators with its own magnificence. The Olympic Stadium was something far more profound in its simplicity, a level stretch of earth, perhaps 200 meters long, bordered by natural hills that had been shaped by countless feet into seating for 40,000 souls who would gather to witness mortals touch the realm of gods through the simple act of running faster than any human being had ever run before. The track itself was nothing more than packed earth, leveled by hand and foot over countless festivals, watered and swept until its surface achieved that perfect balance between firmness and yielding that would allow runners to grip without stumbling, to push off without slipping, to find in the ground beneath their feet a faithful partner in their pursuit of impossible speed. No measurement devices marked the exact distance. The length of the track had been established by the stride of Heracles himself, 600 of his divine paces, creating the standard that would define the stadion race for 1,000 years. At either end of the track stood stone slabs carved with grooves that would cradle the feet of competitors waiting for the start. These starting blocks, called balbides, were more than mere practical equipment. They were sacred thresholds marking the boundary between ordinary human movement and the transcendent act of Olympic competition. The grooves themselves had been worn smooth by the toes of countless athletes, each depression polished by the final moments of preparation before men launched themselves toward immortality. The spectator areas rose from the track in natural tiers, carved into the hillsides by generations of Olympic pilgrims who understood that witnessing greatness was itself a sacred act requiring proper positioning and patient endurance. These were not comfortable seats, but simple earth benches that would test the devotion of those who claimed to honor athletic excellence. To watch the Olympics meant accepting discomfort as the price of proximity to divine performance, burning sun, aching muscles, hours of waiting rewarded by moments of transcendence that justified any amount of physical suffering. But it was not the physical characteristics of the stadium that set it apart from every other athletic venue in the ancient world. It was the accumulated spiritual weight of what had transpired within its boundaries over the centuries since the first Olympic Games began. Every footrace run here had left its invisible mark upon the track. Every victory achieved had added another layer to the sacred significance of this simple oval of earth. The stadium had become a repository of human dreams made manifest, a place where the impossible had been achieved so many times that impossibility itself seemed to lose its meaning. The silence of the pre-dawn hours carried within it the echoes of every crowd that had ever gathered here. 40,000 voices raised in wonder, the sharp intake of breath that preceded miraculous finishes, the thunder of feet racing across sacred ground toward destinations that transcended the simple crossing of finish lines. These sounds lived in the very atoms of the place, waiting to be awakened by the presence of new competitors who would add their own contributions to the eternal symphony of Olympic achievement. The morning light, when it came, revealed the stadium not as an empty space, but as a theatre awaiting its actors. The track stretched before the gathering crowds like a blank papyrus scroll upon which the day's heroes would write their names in movements too swift for ordinary vision to follow. The starting blocks gleamed with dew, that seemed to tremble with anticipation, as if the stone itself understood that it would soon cradle the feet of men attempting to run at speeds that challenged the very boundaries of human possibility. The positioning of the stadium within the sacred grove was itself a form of sacred architecture, surrounded by olive trees whose branches would provide the crowns for victorious athletes, overlooked by the great temple of Zeus whose divine statue would gaze down upon mortal achievements. The track occupied the exact center of a spiritual universe designed to transform athletic competition into religious experience. Every runner who took his position at the starting line stood at the focal point of cosmic attention, the place where mortal striving could attract divine notice and perhaps earn divine favor. The acoustics of the stadium created their own form of magic. The natural bowl formed by the surrounding hills captured and amplified every sound. The sharp commands of race officials, the desperate breathing of sprinting athletes, the rhythmic pounding of feet against earth, and reflected them back to the competitors as a wall of sound that seemed to lift them beyond their normal physical limitations. Many Olympic champions would later describe the sensation of running not just with their own strength, but carried forward by the voices of 40,000 witnesses whose collective will seemed to add supernatural power to merely human muscles. As the morning progressed and the first spectators began to claim their positions on the earthen benches, the stadium gradually awakened from its patient waiting into something alive and expectant. Conversations sparked between strangers who found themselves sharing the same patch of ground. Rivalries formed as supporters of different athletes declared their loyalties, and a sense of collective anticipation began to build that would soon transform individual spectators into a single organism focused entirely on the patch of earth where human limitations would be tested against divine possibility. The track officials began their preparations with the solemnity of priests preparing for the most sacred ritual. They walked the length of the course, examining every inch of surface for irregularities that might affect the outcome of races where victory and defeat could be separated by the breadth of a fingernail. They positioned the turning posts that would mark the boundaries of longer races, checked the starting blocks for perfect alignment, and consulted among themselves with the gravity of men whose decisions would determine which mortals would taste immortal glory and which would know the bitter wisdom of defeat. The athletes themselves began to appear at the edges of the stadium like the first hints of approaching storm, their oiled bodies gleaming in the strengthening sunlight, their movements carrying the controlled tension of predators preparing for the hunt. These were men who had spent years transforming their flesh into instruments capable of achieving the impossible, and their very presence began to charge the atmosphere with the electricity that precedes all great performances. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Olympic Stadium was how it transformed the act of running, the most basic human movement, something every child learns without instruction, into something approaching divine mystery. Within these humble boundaries, the simple placing of one foot in front of the other became charged with cosmic significance. Speed ceased to be merely physical capability and became instead a form of prayer, a way of touching truths too large for words to contain. The stadium waited in the growing light, patient as it had always been, ready to serve once again as the stage for that eternal drama where human beings discover that their limitations exist primarily in their imagination, where the impossible reveals itself to be simply another name for the not yet attempted, where mortals learn that in the pursuit of perfect excellence they approach as closely as flesh can come, to the eternal realm where gods dwell in perpetual celebration of beauty and truth and the kind of achievement that justifies the existence of the entire universe. Soon the silence would be broken by the first race of the day, and the stadium would remember once again why it existed, not to contain athletic competition, but to serve as the threshold between the mortal world and that higher realm, where excellence becomes transcendence and victory transforms both champion and witness into something greater than they were before the race began. In the pale light of dawn, as the sacred fires awakened and the Olympic Stadium prepared to receive its daily offering of human striving, the athletes gathered in the gymnasia that surrounded the sacred precinct moved through their final preparations with the focused intensity of priests preparing for the most sacred ritual. These were not merely competitors training for athletic contests. They were living sacrifices who had spent years transforming their mortal flesh into instruments worthy of divine attention. Men who understood that their bodies had become temples and they themselves both priest and offering within those sacred spaces. The gymnasium was more than a training facility, it was a consecrated ground where the alchemical transformation of ordinary human clay into Olympic gold reached its final stages. The morning air hung thick with the scent of olive oil and sweat, creating an atmosphere that seemed to pulse with the accumulated effort of countless athletes who had prepared for competition within these walls. Every surface bore the invisible marks of their devotion, floors worn smooth by decades of wrestling practice, walls stained with the handprints of men pushing their bodies beyond the boundaries of what seemed possible. The athletic ideal that these men embodied represented a profound synthesis of physical and spiritual development that the modern world struggles to comprehend. They were not specialists focused on a single aspect of human performance, but complete human beings who had achieved harmony between mind, body, and spirit through years of disciplined pursuit of excellence. Their training encompassed not only the development of strength, speed, and endurance, but also the cultivation of moral character, intellectual clarity, and spiritual depth that the Greeks believed were inseparable from true athletic achievement. The preparation of an Olympic athlete's body began not weeks or months, but years before the festival, with a regimen that transformed every aspect of daily existence into service of a single goal: the achievement of human perfection within the bounds of mortal flesh. Their diet consisted of carefully selected foods designed to build strength without excess weight, to provide energy without clouding the mind, to nourish the body while purifying the spirit. Meat from animals raised on sacred ground, bread made from grain blessed by temple priests, water drawn from springs that had never been contaminated by human waste. Every substance that entered their bodies was chosen with the understanding that they were constructing not merely athletic machines, but living offerings to the gods. The physical training itself took on the character of religious observance, each exercise performed with the precision and reverence that marked all sacred activities. The pentathlon athletes, who competed in 5 different events, spent their days moving between disciplines with the fluid grace of dancers performing a cosmic choreography. Their javelin practice became a meditation on the perfect arc of human intention made manifest in bronze and wood, their discus throwing an exploration of the mathematical principles that governed the movement of celestial bodies across the heavens. The runners developed their speed through training methods that seemed designed to teach their bodies to defy the basic laws of physics. They practiced on soft sand that forced their legs to work harder than any earthly track would demand. They ran uphill while carrying weights that made normal competition seem like floating on air. They sprinted until their lungs burned and their vision blurred, and then continued running until they touched that place beyond exhaustion where divine energy begins to flow through mortal muscles. The wrestlers and boxers transformed their bodies into sculptures that would have made Phidias weep with envy. But their beauty was not decorative, it was functional, purposeful, designed around the specific requirements of their disciplines. Every muscle had been developed for maximum efficiency, every sinew trained to respond instantly to conscious command, every reflex honed until the boundary between thought and action virtually disappeared. They moved with the fluid precision of wild animals, their bodies expressing truths about human potential that could not be communicated through words or philosophy. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Olympic athletic preparation was the element of spiritual purification that accompanied every aspect of physical training. These men understood that their bodies were not private possessions to be developed for personal gain, but sacred vessels that would carry divine energy during their moments of competition. They abstained not only from activities that might damage their physical condition, but from anything that might pollute the spiritual clarity necessary for Olympic performance. The month preceding the Games required complete sexual abstinence, not from prudishness, but from understanding that the creative energy normally directed toward reproduction must be conserved and redirected toward the achievement of athletic transcendence. They avoided contact with anything associated with death or decay, understanding that Olympic competition required them to be fountains of pure life force. They purified themselves through ritual baths, sacred meals, and forms of meditation that prepared their spirits for the divine attention they would receive during their moments of competition. The oil with which they anointed their bodies before training and competition was not merely practical lubricant, but consecrated substance that had been blessed by temple priests and infused with herbs sacred to the various gods who governed athletic achievement. The application of this oil became itself a ritual, performed with the same attention to detail that marked all sacred activities. Every inch of skin was massaged until it gleamed like polished bronze, creating a surface that seemed to glow with inner light when struck by the rays of the sun. Their movements during training took on the quality of sacred dance, each gesture refined through endless repetition until it achieved that perfect economy of motion that marked all great athletic performance. The discus thrower's spin became a meditation on the rotation of the earth around the sun. The javelin thrower's approach, a study in the conversion of horizontal motion into vertical flight. The wrestler's holds, an exploration of the leverage principles that governed all physical interaction in the universe. The psychological preparation required for Olympic competition involved a fundamental transformation of identity that few modern athletes achieve or even attempt. These men gradually shed their ordinary personalities, their family names, their city loyalties, their individual quirks and preferences, replacing them with something larger and more universal. By the time they took their positions for competition, they had become archetypal figures representing not their personal ambitions, but the eternal human struggle toward excellence. The final days before competition required a form of fasting that went beyond simple dietary restriction to encompass a complete turning away from all earthly pleasures and distractions. They spent their time in contemplation, prayer, and gentle movement designed to maintain their physical readiness while allowing their spirits to achieve the clarity necessary for perfect performance. Many described entering a state of consciousness where their awareness of the physical world became simultaneously more acute and more detached, as if they were preparing to compete, not as individual human beings, but as vessels through which divine excellence could manifest in the world of form. The night before their events, Olympic athletes often experienced visions or dreams that seemed to come directly from the gods who would judge their performances. Some dreamed of running with divine speed, others of wrestling with superhuman strength, still others of achieving throws or jumps that defied every natural law. These visions were not dismissed as mere fantasy, but accepted as prophecies of what might be achieved if their preparation had been adequate and their spiritual state sufficiently pure. When they finally emerged from the gymnasia to take their positions for competition, these athletes carried within their perfected bodies the accumulated hopes and prayers of their entire communities, the spiritual energy of their years of preparation, and the divine attention that their sacrificial devotion had earned. They were no longer merely human competitors, but living bridges between the mortal and divine realms, men whose achievements would serve as proof that the boundary between earth and heaven was more permeable than ordinary mortals dared to imagine. Their bodies had become offerings, not in the sense of things to be destroyed upon an altar, but in the deeper sense of gifts so perfect that they were worthy of divine attention, vessels so pure that they could contain divine energy, instruments so finely tuned that they could play music that would echo through eternity. In transforming themselves into these living offerings, they had discovered the secret that lay at the heart of all Olympic competition, that human excellence achieved through divine inspiration creates beauty so perfect that it justifies the existence of the entire universe. The moment had arrived that would divide all human history into two chapters, before and after the first Olympic footrace. In the growing light of what would become the most significant morning in the ancient world, 6 runners took their positions at the stone starting blocks of the Olympic Stadium, their nude bodies gleaming with sacred oil, their muscles coiled with the tension of years spent in preparation for this single moment when mortal flesh would attempt to touch the realm of divine speed. The crowd of 40,000 spectators fell into a silence so complete that it seemed as if the entire world had paused to witness this birth of organized athletic competition. Even the wind ceased its movement through the olive branches, as if nature itself recognized that something unprecedented was about to unfold within the sacred precinct. The only sound was the distant crackling of the altar fires and the barely audible whisper of breath moving through 40,000 pairs of lungs that waited in collective anticipation for the command that would release the first competitors in Olympic history. At the center of this cosmic attention stood the runners themselves, men whose names would be lost to history except for one, Corobus of Elis, a cook who would become something far greater than he had ever imagined possible when he rose from his bed that morning to compete in what he could not have known would be the first footrace of eternity. Beside him stood 5 other men whose identities have dissolved into the mists of time, but whose courage in stepping forward to participate in this unprecedented contest ensured their immortality in a different form, as the unknown founders of a tradition that would outlive empires. The stadion race was elegance itself in its simplicity, a straight sprint covering approximately 200 meters, the length that Heracles himself had paced out with his divine stride. No turns, no complex strategy, no equipment beyond the runner's own body and will, simply the purest test of human speed over a distance that would allow spectators to witness every moment of the contest from start to finish. The winner would be the man who could cover that sacred ground in the least amount of time, but what they were really racing toward was something that transcended mere temporal measurement. They were running toward immortality itself. The starter, himself a figure whose authority derived from divine appointment rather than human selection, raised his bronze rod above his head while the runners settled into their starting positions with movements that carried the weight of ritual. Their feet found the grooves carved into the stone balbides, their bodies curved into starting positions that had been refined through years of training, their eyes fixed on the distant finish line that marked the boundary between mortal effort and eternal glory. The silence deepened until it became almost unbearable, a pregnant pause that contained within itself all the accumulated energy of human striving since the first mortal dreamed of running faster than any mortal had ever run before. The runners could feel the weight of divine attention settling upon their shoulders like a tangible presence, the consciousness that they were about to perform not merely for the 40,000 human witnesses, but for the gods themselves, who had descended from Olympus to observe this inauguration of their festival. Ready. The starter's voice cut through the silence like bronze through silk, and the 6 runners froze into perfect stillness, their bodies transformed into compressed springs of human potential awaiting release. Every muscle, every sinew, every fiber of their being focused into this single moment of absolute preparation, when thought ceased and pure intention took control of flesh that had been prepared for years to respond with superhuman precision to the demands of Olympic competition. The rod fell. For one perfect instant, time itself seemed suspended as 6 human beings launched themselves forward with an explosion of movement that appeared to defy every natural law. Their feet struck the sacred earth with the synchronized percussion of thunder, their bodies uncoiled with the violent grace of released catapults, their faces transformed into masks of divine concentration as they entered that altered state of consciousness where Olympic performance becomes possible. The first strides carried them forward, with speed that seemed to surprise even the runners themselves, as if the sacred nature of the ground beneath their feet was adding supernatural power to their merely human strength. The crowd's initial gasp of wonder created a wave of sound that crashed over the competitors like a breaking sea, lifting them even higher above their normal capabilities, transforming them from individual athletes into manifestations of pure human potential. 20 meters into the race, the field began to separate into leaders and followers, but the differences were measured in finger breadths rather than clear advantages. These were all men who had earned their places in this unprecedented contest through demonstrations of speed that had amazed their home communities, and the gap that would eventually determine victory was opening with agonizing slowness, visible only to eyes trained to measure the microscopic advantages that separate greatness from transcendence. At the 50-meter mark, 3 runners had emerged from the pack. Coroebus in the center, flanked by 2 competitors whose names would be lost, but whose courage in pushing the unknown champion to his limits would ensure that the first Olympic victory would be truly earned rather than simply awarded. The spectators were on their feet now, their voices joining in a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sacred grove, their collective will focused on these 3 flying figures who represented the absolute pinnacle of human speed. The middle section of the race passed in a blur of pumping arms and driving legs, the runners entering that transcendent state where conscious thought dissolves and pure instinct takes control of bodies that have been trained to function beyond the ordinary limits of mortal flesh. They were no longer running with human speed, but with something approaching divine velocity, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground as they flew toward the finish line with movements too swift for normal vision to follow clearly. With 50 meters remaining, Coroebus began to edge ahead of his rivals with a surge of speed that seemed to come from some source beyond his individual strength. The crowd recognized that they were witnessing something miraculous, not merely the first Olympic victory, but a performance that transcended the boundaries of normal human capability. His face had taken on an expression of serene concentration that suggested he was no longer completely present in the world of ordinary experience, but had entered some higher realm where divine energy could flow through mortal muscles. The final 20 meters became an eternity compressed into seconds, as Coroebus pulled away from his rivals with each stride, his body moving with mechanical precision that seemed to mock the very concept of human limitation. The finish line approached like a portal between worlds. On one side lay the realm of mortal striving, on the other the eternal domain where Olympic champions would dwell forever in the memory of humanity. Coroebus crossed the line, a full step ahead of his nearest rival, his victory so clear that no judge needed to render a decision. But the true measure of his achievement lay not in the margin of his victory, but in what he had accomplished simply by participating in this unprecedented contest. He had become the first Olympic champion, the man whose name would forever mark the beginning of organized athletic competition, the mortal who had proven that human beings possessed within themselves the capacity to create beauty so perfect that gods would pause in their eternal celebrations to witness its manifestation. The crowd erupted in a frenzy of celebration that seemed to lift the very roof of the sky, their voices joining in a thunderous acclamation that would echo through the centuries wherever human beings gathered to test the limits of mortal capability. But beneath the surface celebration lay a deeper recognition. They had just witnessed the birth of something that would outlive every empire, something that would carry the Olympic flame across thousands of years to kindle the imagination of generations yet unborn. Coroebus stood at the finish line gasping for breath, his body still trembling with the divine energy that had carried him to victory, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just achieved. He had entered the race as a cook from Ellis, but he emerged from it as something unprecedented in human history. The first Olympic champion, the man who had proven that mortal flesh could serve as a vessel for divine excellence, the founder of a tradition that would transform human understanding of what it meant to strive for perfection. The echo of that first footrace continued to reverberate through the sacred grove long after the runners had departed and the spectators had fallen silent. Something had changed in the fundamental relationship between mortals and gods. Something had been proven about human potential that could never again be questioned. The impossible had been achieved, and in being achieved, it had redefined the very meaning of impossibility itself. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sacred grove in shades of gold that seemed to emanate from the olive trees themselves, the moment arrived that every competitor had dreamed of and every spectator had journeyed countless miles to witness the crowning of the Olympic champions. Yet those who witnessed these ceremonies often spoke not of pure joy, but of something more complex, a bittersweet recognition that perfect triumph carries within itself the seeds of its own ending, that the moment of ultimate victory is also inevitably the beginning of its transformation into memory. The victor's procession moved through the sacred precinct with the solemn dignity of a religious ceremony, because that was precisely what it had become. The champions walked not as conquering athletes, but as men who had been touched by divine favor and must now receive the visible symbols of that divine recognition. Their bodies still gleamed with the sacred oil and honest sweat of competition, their faces bearing expressions that mixed exhaustion with wonder, pride with something approaching sadness, the look of men who had achieved their ultimate goal and now faced the question of what meaning life could hold after touching perfection. The olive crowns that awaited them had been cut that morning from the sacred tree that grew within the precinct, the wild olive whose branches had been blessed by Zeus himself when he first established this sanctuary as a place where mortals might approach divine excellence through the perfection of physical achievement. These were not ornate constructions of gold and silver, such as earthly kings might wear, but simple wreaths of living branches that would begin to wither even as they were placed upon the victors' heads. Beautiful precisely because they were temporary, meaningful exactly because they acknowledged the fleeting nature of all mortal achievement. The priest who performed the crowning ceremony moved with the gravity of one who understood that he was serving as an intermediary between human and divine realms. That the wreaths he placed were not merely symbols of athletic victory, but visible signs of divine approval bestowed upon mortals who had proven themselves worthy of Olympic glory. Each crown was placed with words of blessing that connected the individual champion to the eternal tradition of Olympic excellence, making them part of something larger than their personal achievement. But it was the expression in the victor's eyes that revealed the deeper truth about Olympic triumph, that the achievement of perfect victory brings with it a form of cosmic loneliness that few mortals are prepared to endure. These men had spent years, perhaps their entire adult lives, focused on a single goal that had now been achieved. They had reached the summit of human athletic achievement, and from that pinnacle, they could see with terrible clarity that there would never again be another moment quite like this one. Never again an opportunity to experience the transcendent joy of touching divine excellence through mortal effort. Cororibus, the first Olympic champion, stood at the center of the ceremony with tears streaming down his face, not tears of simple joy, but something far more complex. In winning the Stadion race, he had achieved immortality of a sort, ensuring that his name would be remembered as long as human beings gathered to compete in games of athletic excellence. But he had also reached an ending, had climbed to a height from which the only movement possible was descent back into the realm of ordinary human experience, where nothing would ever again possess the pure significance of this moment. The spectators who witnessed these crowning ceremonies often reported feeling a strange mixture of celebration and mourning, as if they were attending both a triumph and a funeral. They had seen human beings achieve something approaching divine status through the perfection of physical performance, but they had also witnessed the terrible isolation that comes with such achievement. The champions stood alone on their pedestals of victory, separated from ordinary humanity by their extraordinary accomplishment, citizens now of a realm that few mortals would ever visit. The olive crown itself became a meditation on the nature of temporal achievement within eternal frameworks. The branches would wither within days, their green leaves turning brown and brittle, their living flexibility becoming lifeless fragility. But this physical deterioration only emphasized the deeper truth that the real crown, the crown of immortal memory, would never fade. The olive branches were merely the visible symbol of something invisible and eternal, the mark of recognition from gods who valued human excellence above all mortal treasures. The procession that carried the crowned champions through the sacred grove and into the surrounding communities became a moving lesson in the relationship between individual achievement and collective meaning. The victors belonged not only to themselves or even to their home cities, but to all humanity as living proof of what mortal flesh could achieve when guided by divine inspiration and sustained by years of perfect dedication. Their victories were gifts given to the entire human community, demonstrations that the boundaries of possibility were far more flexible than ordinary experience suggested. The celebrations that followed the crowning ceremonies carried their own form of melancholy, as if the participants understood that they were trying to extend a moment that was already passing into history. Wine was poured, songs were sung, Stories were told of the competitions that had just concluded, but underneath the surface, joy lay the recognition that this particular combination of athletes, spectators, and circumstances would never exist again. Each Olympic festival was unique and unrepeatable, a brief flowering of human excellence that would live forever in memory precisely because it could never be recreated in fact. The champions themselves often spoke of experiencing a strange form of depression in the days following their victories, a psychological descent from the heights of Olympic achievement into the valleys of ordinary human experience, where nothing possessed the crystalline clarity and absolute significance of Olympic competition. They had tasted divine nectar and must now return to earthly bread, had touched immortality and must now resume their mortal lives, had proven themselves capable of transcendent performance and must now find meaning in activities that seemed pale and insignificant by comparison. Yet this melancholy was itself part of the Olympic mystery, a necessary component of the transformation that athletic competition could work upon both participants and witnesses. The sadness that accompanied Olympic victory was not pathological but educational, teaching both champions and spectators that human excellence achieved its greatest meaning, not through permanence but through poignancy, not through duration but through intensity, not through possession. The olive crown represented a profound philosophical statement about the nature of human achievement and divine recognition. Unlike material prizes that could be accumulated, stored, or passed on to heirs, the Olympic crown existed primarily as experience rather than possession. It crowned the victor with a moment of perfect recognition rather than a lifetime of material advantage, acknowledged divine favor rather than conferring earthly power, marked spiritual achievement rather than economic gain. The true glory of Olympic victory lay not in the moment of triumph itself, but in the eternal echo that triumph would create in the memory of humanity. The champions were crowned not with possessions but with stories, not with wealth but with immortality, not with power but with the kind of recognition that transforms mortal men into eternal symbols of human possibility. Their names would be spoken with reverence by generations who never witnessed their achievements, but who found inspiration in the knowledge that such achievements were possible. As the sun set on the Olympic festival, and the champions departed to carry their olive crowns back to their home cities, they bore with them something more precious than any material treasure, the knowledge that they had participated in the fundamental mystery of human existence, the eternal tension between limitation and transcendence, between what we are and what we might become. They had discovered that the greatest victories are those that remind us not of our power, but of our potential, not of what we have achieved, but of what achievement itself means in a universe where mortals can touch divinity through the simple act of striving for perfection. The crowns would wither, the celebrations would end, the spectators would return to their ordinary lives, but the echo of Olympic achievement would continue to reverberate through human consciousness as long as mortals dared to dream of excellence and possessed the courage to pursue those dreams, even unto the realm where gods dwell in eternal appreciation of beauty, truth, and the kind of achievement that justifies the existence of the entire cosmos. In the lengthening shadows of the Olympic evening, when the crowned champions had received their glory and the crowds had sung their victory songs, attention turned to those whose stories the official records would never preserve, the vast majority of Olympic competitors who had given everything they possessed in pursuit of excellence and found that everything was not enough. These were the defeated, The men who had trained for years, traveled across dangerous territories, sacrificed their youth and their comfort and their ordinary dreams, only to discover in the most public way possible that divine favor had been granted to others. Yet to call them simply defeated would be to misunderstand the profound spiritual dimensions of Olympic competition, where victory and defeat were both forms of divine communication, both ways that gods taught mortals about the nature of excellence, limitation, and the mysterious relationship between human striving and cosmic purpose. The men who lost their races carried within themselves lessons that could not be learned through victory, wisdom that could only be acquired through the willing embrace of their own insufficiency in the face of transcendent standards. Consider the runner who had dominated every race in his home city, who had arrived at Olympia carrying the hopes and prayers of his entire community, who had trained with such dedication that his body had become a perfect instrument of speed, and who found himself trailing behind Olympic champions whose capabilities seemed to exist in an entirely different realm of possibility. The moment when such a man realized that his lifetime of preparation would not be enough, that divine favor had been granted to others, that his dreams of Olympic glory would remain forever unfulfilled. Such moments taught truths about human limitation that no victory could ever reveal. The wrestling matches provided perhaps the most dramatic examples of this divine pedagogy through defeat. These were men who had spent years transforming their bodies into instruments of controlled violence, who had mastered every hold and counterhold known to their sport, who approached Olympic competition with the confidence that comes from never having met an opponent they could not eventually overcome. Yet Olympic wrestling operated according to different laws than ordinary athletic competition. Here, divine attention could transform adequate technique into transcendent performance, could grant supernatural strength to competitors who approach their contests with proper reverence and spiritual preparation. The boxer who found himself outmatched not by superior training, but by something approaching divine intervention, learned lessons about humility that would transform his understanding of human capability for the rest of his life. He had prepared his body for maximum damage, absorption, and delivery, had conditioned his mind for the strategic complexities of armed combat, had arrived at Olympia believing that victory was simply a matter of applying his proven skills against inferior opposition. The discovery that Olympic competition existed in a realm where normal human calculations became irrelevant was often more devastating than any physical blow he received during his defeat. But perhaps the most poignant defeats belonged to those competitors who had achieved technical perfection in their events, but lacked that indefinable quality that attracted divine attention. The javelin thrower whose technique was flawless, but whose throws fell short of Olympic standards, learned that excellence in athletics required more than mechanical precision. It demanded some form of spiritual alignment that could not be taught through ordinary training methods. The discus thrower, who had broken every record in his region but found his Olympic performances strangely diminished, discovered that competing in the sacred precinct required forms of preparation that went far beyond physical conditioning. These defeated athletes often experienced their losses not as simple competitive failures, but as profound spiritual revelations about the nature of human limitation and divine justice. They had approached Olympic competition with the unconscious assumption that their personal desires, properly supported by adequate preparation, would be sufficient to earn divine favor. The discovery that the gods operated according to principles beyond human understanding, that divine grace could not be earned through effort alone, that cosmic justice might have purposes larger than individual ambition. These revelations often proved more transformative than any victory could have been. The journey home for defeated Olympic competitors became itself a form of pilgrimage, but one that led toward wisdom rather than celebration. These men carried within themselves the precious knowledge of their own limitations, the hard-won understanding that human excellence exists within cosmic frameworks larger than individual achievement. They had discovered that true competition was not between athletes, but between human possibility and divine standards that remained forever beyond complete mortal comprehension. Many of these defeated competitors would return to their home cities transformed in ways that were invisible to casual observation, but profound in their implications for how they approached the remainder of their lives. They had touched the absolute standards of excellence that governed Olympic competition and found themselves insufficient, not through any failure of effort or dedication, but through the simple fact that divine favor operates according to principles that transcend human understanding or control. This encounter with cosmic limitation often produced a form of wisdom that was deeper and more lasting than the temporary glory achieved by Olympic victors. The defeated athletes had learned that the universe contained standards of excellence so high that even perfect human preparation might prove inadequate, that divine justice operated according to principles larger than individual merit, that true competition required the willingness to strive for goals that might forever remain beyond reach. Some would return to their athletic training with renewed dedication, understanding now that Olympic competition required forms of preparation that encompassed spiritual as well as physical development. Others would abandon competitive athletics altogether, applying the lessons learned through Olympic defeat to other forms of human striving, philosophy, art, governance, or spiritual practice. All carried within themselves the invaluable knowledge that human excellence achieves its greatest meaning, not through guaranteed success, but through the willingness to risk failure in pursuit of transcendent goals. The gods, it seemed, loved these defeated competitors as much as they loved the victors, but they loved them in a different way, as students rather than exemplars, as seekers rather than achievers, as human beings who had proven their willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of excellence, even when that sacrifice led to visible failure rather than public triumph. Their defeats became forms of divine education that prepared them for forms of achievement that might be invisible to public observation, but no less real in their significance for human development. The Olympic festival required both victory and defeat to achieve its complete spiritual purpose. The victors provided proof that divine excellence could manifest through human effort, that mortal flesh could serve as a vessel for transcendent achievement, that the boundary between earth and heaven was more permeable than ordinary experience suggested. The defeated provided equally important proof that human striving had meaning independent of success, that the pursuit of excellence justified itself through the attempt rather than the outcome. That divine love encompassed all who approached Olympic competition with proper reverence regardless of their final ranking. In the cosmic accounting that governed Olympic competition, defeat was not the opposite of victory, but its necessary complement, not the failure of human striving, but evidence of its ultimate significance. The defeated athletes had participated as fully in the Olympic mystery as the crowned champions. They had simply received different lessons from the same divine teachers, had been granted different forms of wisdom by the same cosmic curriculum that used both triumph and failure as tools for human development. Their tears were as sacred as the victors' celebrations, their disappointment as meaningful as the champion's joy, their courage in accepting defeat as admirable as the winner's grace in achieving victory. They returned home, not as failures, but as graduates of the most demanding school in the ancient world. Men who had learned truths about human limitation and divine purpose that could not be acquired through any other form of education. Wisdom that would serve them for the remainder of their lives in ways that transcended the temporary glory of any athletic achievement. As the Olympic festival reached its conclusion and the sacred fires began their gradual descent toward embers, something unprecedented in human history began to unfold. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not the close of a great celebration, but the first movement in a symphony that would echo across continents and centuries. The 40,000 pilgrims who had gathered to witness the birth of organized athletic competition now became something far more significant than mere spectators. They became the living vessels through which the Olympic ideal would spread to every corner of the known world and beyond. The roads that led away from Olympia in all directions suddenly carried more than tired travelers returning to their ordinary lives. They carried the seeds of transformation that would take root in distant cities and grow into festivals, philosophies, and ways of understanding human potential that would reshape civilization itself. Each departing pilgrim bore within their memory not just the vivid recollections of specific athletic achievements, but something deeper and more revolutionary. Proof that human beings possessed capabilities that far exceeded anything their previous experience had suggested was possible. The Athenian merchants who had witnessed Corybus cross the finish line in that first stadion race returned to their city carrying more than memories. They carried a new vision of what athletic competition could become when it transcended the simple tribal warfare that had previously characterized most physical contests between communities. They spoke in the agora of men who had competed not to destroy their opponents, but to honor the gods through the demonstration of human excellence, of victories that enhanced rather than diminished the defeated, of contests where divine attention had transformed ordinary mortals into something approaching the heroic figures of ancient legend. The Spartan warriors who had observed the wrestling and boxing competitions found themselves questioning assumptions about physical combat that had defined their entire military culture. They had witnessed contests where victory came not through the application of superior violence, but through technical mastery, spiritual preparation, and the kind of divine favor that could only be earned through years of dedicated training and proper reverence for the cosmic principles that governed all true competition. They returned to their barracks with stories of combat that elevated rather than degraded the participants, of physical contests that served spiritual rather than merely political purposes. The philosophers from the Ionian colonies discovered in Olympic competition a physical manifestation of metaphysical principles they had previously understood only in abstract terms. The pursuit of excellence, the relationship between individual achievement and universal standards, the possibility of human transcendence through dedicated practice. These concepts that had existed in their minds as theoretical constructs had been made visible in the Olympic Stadium as living demonstrations of philosophical truth expressed through athletic performance. As these witnesses traveled homeward, their conversations along the roads created spontaneous seminars in Olympic philosophy that reached far beyond the formal boundaries of the festival itself. Strangers who might never have spoken in ordinary circumstances found themselves engaged in passionate discussions about the nature of competition, excellence, and the proper relationship between human ambition and divine favor. The Olympic ideal became a traveling university whose curriculum was carried in the memories and imaginations of ordinary people who had been transformed by their encounter with extraordinary achievement. The impact on local athletic traditions was immediate and profound. Cities that had previously organized simple foot races or wrestling matches as part of religious festivals suddenly found themselves redesigning these events according to Olympic principles. The emphasis shifted from local pride and tribal superiority to the celebration of human excellence as a form of divine worship. Training methods evolved to encompass spiritual as well as physical preparation. Competition rules were refined to ensure fairness and honor rather than mere victory at any cost. But the Olympic influence extended far beyond athletic competition into realms that the original organizers could never have anticipated. The artistic communities of various cities found themselves inspired by Olympic examples to pursue their own forms of excellence with the same dedication and spiritual focus that characterized Olympic athletic preparation. Sculptors began creating works that captured not just physical beauty, but the spiritual radiance they had witnessed in Olympic competitors. Poets developed new forms of verse designed to celebrate human achievement in ways that honored both individual accomplishment and universal principles. The educational systems of progressive cities began incorporating Olympic ideals into their curricula, teaching young men that physical development and intellectual growth were complementary rather than competing pursuits. The Olympic model of balanced excellence, the harmony of mind, body, and spirit demonstrated by successful competitors, became a template for human development that influenced everything from gymnasium design to philosophical instruction to moral education. The political implications proved equally revolutionary. Cities that had witnessed the Olympic truce and observed the peaceful coexistence of traditional enemies during the festival began experimenting with new forms of diplomacy based on Olympic principles. If men from warring city-states could compete honorably in athletic contests while maintaining their competitive intensity, perhaps political conflicts could be resolved through forms of contest that enhanced rather than destroyed the participants. The merchant classes found in Olympic competition a model for economic activity that transcended simple profit maximization. The emphasis on excellence, honor, and divine favor provided a framework for commercial relationships that acknowledged spiritual as well as material dimensions of human exchange. Trade agreements began incorporating concepts of fairness and mutual enhancement that reflected Olympic values applied to economic activity. Religious communities discovered that Olympic competition offered new ways of understanding the relationship between human striving and divine approval. The Olympic model suggested that gods could be honored not only through sacrifice and prayer, but through the dedicated pursuit of human excellence in any field of endeavor. This insight revolutionized approaches to spiritual practice, suggesting that divine favor could be earned through perfect dedication to excellence in whatever calling an individual felt drawn to pursue. The influence spread far beyond the Greek-speaking world, as travelers, merchants, and colonists carried Olympic stories to distant lands where different cultures interpreted these ideals through their own philosophical and religious frameworks. The basic principles that human excellence could honor divine purposes, that competition could enhance rather than diminish participants, that individual achievement served universal purposes, proved adaptable to widely varying cultural contexts. Even the military applications of Olympic principles proved transformative. Armies that had previously focused solely on victory through superior violence began incorporating Olympic concepts of honor, technical excellence, and spiritual preparation into their training methods. The result was not just more effective military forces, but warrior cultures that maintained their effectiveness while developing more sophisticated concepts of heroism and honor. The architectural influence became visible as cities began constructing athletic facilities designed according to Olympic principles, not just as practical spaces for physical training, but as sacred precincts where human excellence could be pursued as a form of religious practice. These gymnasia and stadiums became centers of community life that served educational, spiritual, and cultural functions far beyond their original athletic purposes. Perhaps most significantly, the Olympic ideal provided humanity with its first truly universal language for discussing human potential and achievement. Regardless of local customs, political systems, or religious traditions, people could communicate about excellence, dedication, honor, and the proper relationship between individual ambition and cosmic purpose, using concepts derived from Olympic competition. This shared vocabulary enabled forms of cultural exchange and mutual understanding that had been impossible before the Olympic example demonstrated that competitive excellence could serve universal rather than merely tribal purposes. The sacred grove of Olympia had become the center of an expanding circle of influence that would eventually encompass the known world and reach across centuries to touch civilizations that had not yet been born. The simple footrace that Corybus had won was revealed to be not just the first Olympic event, but the first movement in a cultural revolution that would transform human understanding of competition, excellence, and the possibilities inherent in mortal flesh, guided by divine inspiration. The travelers departed carrying fire stolen from the Olympic altar, not literally, but in the form of memories and ideals that would kindle new flames wherever they settled. The games were over, but the Olympic spirit had begun its eternal journey through human consciousness, proving that some victories transcend their immediate circumstances to become permanent features of the spiritual landscape that shapes all future human striving toward excellence. Time moves like water through stone, slowly but with inexorable persistence. And even the most sacred human institutions must eventually yield to its transforming power. The Olympic Games that had begun with such simplicity and pure intention, a single footrace run by 6 men in honor of Zeus, gradually evolved into something magnificent and complex, drawing competitors from across the expanding Greek world, lasting for days rather than hours, encompassing athletic disciplines that would have amazed the first Olympic organizers. The festival grew as Greece itself grew, as colonies spread across the Mediterranean and Olympic ideals took root in distant cities that sent their finest athletes to compete in the sacred grove. New events were added with each generation: the diaulos, a double-length footrace that tested endurance as well as speed; the dolichos, a long-distance run that pushed human stamina to its limits; the pentathlon, that perfect synthesis of athletic skills that demanded excellence in running, jumping, wrestling, discus, and javelin throwing. The festival expanded to include chariot racing that brought the thunder of horses and the crash of bronze-wheeled vehicles to the sacred precinct; boxing and wrestling competitions that elevated physical combat to the level of sacred art; and musical contests that acknowledged the Olympic principle that human excellence encompassed spiritual as well as physical achievement. With growth came grandeur that would have seemed impossible to those who witnessed the first simple ceremonies. The Temple of Zeus rose to house a statue of the King of Gods that was counted among the 7 wonders of the world, a 40-foot seated figure wrought in gold and ivory by the master sculptor Phidias, so magnificent that many who beheld it claimed to have seen Zeus himself rather than mere human artistry. The sacred precinct expanded to include temples, treasuries, gymnasia, and baths that could accommodate the thousands of athletes and tens of thousands of spectators who gathered every 4 years to celebrate human excellence in honor of divine majesty. The ceremonies became elaborate pageants that lasted for 5 full days, with ritual processions, religious sacrifices, artistic performances, and athletic competitions woven together into a complex tapestry of celebration that encompassed every aspect of Greek cultural achievement. The Olympic Truce expanded to cover longer periods and wider territories as the influence of the Games spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Kings and emperors competed alongside humble farmers' sons, understanding that Olympic victory conferred a form of immortality that no earthly power could grant. Yet, even as the Games reached heights of magnificence that seemed to ensure their eternal continuation, the forces that would eventually destroy them were already gathering strength beyond the borders of the Greek world. Rome rose to dominate first Italy, then the Mediterranean, bringing with it a different understanding of competition, spectacle, and the proper relationship between athletic achievement and political power. The Romans appreciated Greek athletic traditions, but transformed them according to their own cultural values, introducing elements of professional entertainment and political propaganda that gradually altered the spiritual character of Olympic competition. The festivals continued for more than 1,000 years, surviving the conquest of Greece, the rise and fall of the Roman Republic, the establishment of the empire, and the gradual transformation of Mediterranean civilization from a collection of independent city-states into a unified political and cultural system centered on Rome. Olympic victors continued to receive their olive crowns, continued to earn immortal glory through athletic achievement, continued to demonstrate that human excellence could transcend political and cultural boundaries. But subtle changes accumulated like sediment in a river, gradually altering the essential character of the Games without any single moment of dramatic transformation. Professional athletes began to replace the citizen competitors who had characterized the classical period. Financial rewards supplemented the spiritual satisfaction that had originally motivated Olympic participation. Political considerations influenced the selection of competitors and the judgment of contests. The pure amateur ideal that had defined Olympic competition for centuries began to give way to more complex motivations that reflected the changing values of the societies that supported the Games. The rise of Christianity introduced religious conflicts that struck at the theological foundations of Olympic competition. The new faith condemned the festivals as pagan celebrations that honored false gods through the worship of human physical achievement. Christian emperors faced growing pressure from religious leaders who viewed Olympic competition as incompatible with proper worship of the one true God. The theological arguments against the Games proved more destructive than any military conquest, attacking the spiritual justification that had always provided the deeper meaning for Olympic competition. Emperor Theodosius I delivered the final blow in 39 CE, when he banned all pagan festivals throughout the Roman Empire as part of his campaign to establish Christianity as the sole legitimate religion. The Olympic Games, which had survived foreign conquest, political revolution, and cultural transformation, could not survive religious prohibition. The 1,000-year celebration of human excellence through athletic competition came to an end not through military defeat or popular indifference, but through imperial decree backed by religious conviction. The abandonment of the Olympic site proceeded with heartbreaking inevitability. The sacred fires that had burned for over a millennium were extinguished forever. The temples were stripped of their treasures and left to the gradual destruction of weather and neglect. The stadium where countless champions had achieved immortal glory gradually filled with the debris of collapsing buildings and the accumulated soil of centuries. Earthquakes toppled the remaining structures, Floods altered the course of the Alpheus River, and the very location of ancient Olympia began to fade from human memory. The irony was cosmic in its completeness. A festival that had celebrated the permanent significance of temporary human achievement was itself revealed to be temporary, subject to the same forces of change and decay that governed all mortal endeavors. The Olympic Games that had seemed as eternal as the gods they honored proved as vulnerable to historical transformation as any other human institution. The site that had once drawn pilgrims from across the civilized world became a forgotten valley where shepherds grazed their flocks among ruins they could not identify. For 15 centuries, the Olympic tradition existed only in scattered literary references that seemed more mythological than historical to readers who had never witnessed athletic competition on such a scale. Medieval scholars debated whether the games described in ancient texts had ever actually existed or were merely poetic fantasies created by writers who wished to imagine a golden age of human achievement that had never actually occurred in historical reality. The forest gradually reclaimed the sacred grove. Olive trees grew wild among the fallen columns of temples. The stadium became a meadow where wildflowers bloomed each spring over the track where Olympic champions had once run faster than any humans in the world. The altar of Zeus, built from the ashes of countless sacrifices, weathered into an unrecognizable mound that travelers passed without recognizing its significance. Nature completed the destruction that human neglect had begun, creating a silence so complete that it seemed impossible that this quiet valley had ever echoed with the cheers of 40,000 spectators celebrating human excellence. Yet even in this apparent death, something of the Olympic spirit persisted in forms that transcended physical preservation. The ideals that had motivated the original games, the pursuit of excellence, the celebration of human potential, the understanding that competition could serve spiritual purposes, continued to influence human culture through channels that had nothing to do with organized athletics. Renaissance philosophers rediscovered ancient Olympic texts and found in them inspiration for educational theories that emphasized the development of mind and body in harmony. Enlightenment thinkers used Olympic examples to argue for the possibility of human perfectibility through dedicated effort and proper training. The Olympic memory survived its physical destruction, preserved in the collective unconscious of humanity as a dream of what competition could become when guided by the highest human values. This dream waited patiently through the centuries of forgetting, like a seed buried in winter soil, ready to spring to new life when the proper conditions for germination finally appeared. The archaeological excavations that would eventually rediscover the buried ruins of Olympia found more than ancient stones and bronze artifacts. They found evidence of a human achievement so magnificent that it demanded resurrection, proof of possibilities so inspiring that they could not be allowed to remain buried beneath the accumulated debris of history. The Olympic Games had died, but the Olympic ideal had achieved a form of immortality that transcended any particular historical manifestation. In the end, time had not destroyed the Olympics, but had instead revealed their essential indestructibility. What could be buried could also be excavated. What could be forgotten could also be remembered. What could die could also be reborn. The silence that descended upon the sacred grove was not the silence of ending, but the silence of gestation, the quiet that precedes all new beginnings, the pause between movements in a symphony that had only seemed to reach its conclusion. The resurrection began not with fanfare, but with the patient scraping of shovels against earth that had kept its secrets for 15 centuries. In the winter of 1875, German archaeologist Ernst Curtius stood in a forgotten valley in the western Peloponnese, holding in his hands a bronze coin that bore the image of Zeus and the inscription Olympia. For the first time since the ancient games had been banned by Christian emperors, a human being held tangible proof that the legendary sanctuary was more than literary fantasy. It was historical reality, waiting to be awakened from its long sleep beneath accumulated soil and debris. The excavation that followed became itself a form of Olympic competition, a contest between human determination and the Earth's patient concealment of the past. Curtius and his team approached their work with the reverence of pilgrims as much as the precision of scientists, understanding that they were not merely uncovering archaeological artifacts, but resurrecting one of humanity's most significant spiritual and cultural achievements. Each shovelful of earth removed was a step backward through time, each fragment of marble or bronze a message from ancestors who had participated in mysteries that modern civilization could barely comprehend. The first major discovery came when the excavator's tools struck the white marble foundations of what would prove to be the Temple of Zeus. As they carefully brushed away the accumulated soil of centuries, the outline of the massive structure gradually emerged like a sleeping giant awakening from an impossibly long dream. The temple had been reduced to its foundations by earthquakes and human destruction, but those foundations revealed the enormous scale of the building that had once housed Phidias's legendary statue of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The emotions experienced by the excavation team defied simple description. These men had dedicated their professional lives to the study of ancient civilization, but they had never expected to participate directly in the resurrection of something so magnificent and so completely lost to human memory. They were not merely discovering archaeological evidence, but witnessing the return of the dead, the impossible restoration of something that had seemed as permanently lost as any human achievement could be. As the work progressed and more of the sanctuary was revealed, the excavators began to understand the profound spiritual dimensions of what they were uncovering. This was not simply an ancient athletic facility, but a complete religious complex designed to serve as a bridge between mortal and divine realms. The stadium emerged from its earthly burial with its track still visible, the stone starting blocks still in position, the seating areas carved into the hillsides still capable of accommodating tens of thousands of spectators. It was as if the ancient competitors had just departed and the Olympic Games might resume at any moment. The discovery of the altar of Zeus provided perhaps the most powerful emotional moment of the entire excavation. As the archaeologists carefully exposed the massive mound of hardened ash and clay that had been built up over centuries of Olympic sacrifices, they realized they were touching the very heart of ancient Olympic religious practice. This altar had received the blood of thousands of sacrificial animals, had been the focal point of prayers offered by countless pilgrims, had served as the physical connection between the Olympic Games and the divine realm that gave those games their ultimate meaning. The artifacts that emerged from the earth told stories that brought tears to the eyes of even the most scientifically detached observers. Bronze victory wreaths, still green with the patina of centuries, had once crowned Olympic champions whose achievements had been considered worthy of divine recognition. Discuses and javelins, their surfaces polished smooth by ancient hands, had been the instruments through which mortal athletes had touched the realm of transcendent performance. Inscriptions carved in stone preserved the names of victors who had achieved immortality through athletic excellence, names that had been lost to human memory but had waited patiently in the earth for the moment of their rediscovery. But perhaps the most profound discovery was not any single artifact, but the gradual recognition that the Olympic sanctuary had been preserved with almost miraculous completeness beneath its protective covering of soil and debris. The layout of the sacred precinct, the relationship between athletic and religious areas, the integration of temples and training facilities, all had been maintained in a state that allowed modern observers to understand not just what the ancient Olympics had been, but why they had possessed such extraordinary significance for the civilizations that created and sustained them. The excavation team began to realize that they were participating in an event of cosmic significance, the return of ideals and practices that humanity had lost but desperately needed to rediscover. The ancient Olympic synthesis of athletic competition, religious devotion, artistic achievement, and international cooperation offered a model for human excellence that transcended the limited nationalistic and materialistic values that characterized much of 19th century European civilization. News of the discoveries spread across Europe like wildfire, capturing the imagination of a generation that had grown increasingly skeptical about the possibility of human perfectibility and international harmony. The Olympic excavations offered tangible proof that human beings had once achieved forms of excellence and cooperation that seemed almost impossible in the modern world. The ancient games provided evidence that competition could enhance rather than destroy human relationships, that athletic achievement could serve spiritual purposes, that international festivals could promote peace rather than conflict. The French educator Baron Pierre de Coubertin visited the excavation site in 1890 and experienced what he later described as a religious revelation. Standing in the ancient stadium where Corobus had won the first Olympic footrace, Coubertin understood that the Olympic ideals were not merely historical curiosities, but living principles that could be adapted to serve the needs of modern civilization. The resurrection of the Olympic site demanded the resurrection of the Olympic Games themselves. The artifacts discovered at Olympia began to appear in museums across Europe, but their significance transcended their value as historical specimens. They served as physical reminders of human possibilities that had been forgotten but not destroyed, achievements that had been buried but not eliminated from the collective memory of the species. The bronze and marble fragments became seeds of inspiration that would eventually grow into the modern Olympic movement. The excavation itself became a model for international cooperation that reflected ancient Olympic values in modern form. German, French, and Greek scholars worked together with a harmony that transcended the political tensions and national rivalries that characterized late 19th century Europe. Their collaboration demonstrated that shared dedication to human excellence could overcome the divisions that seemed to make international cooperation impossible in other spheres of activity. As the excavation progressed through multiple seasons and gradually revealed the complete layout of the ancient sanctuary, visitors from around the world began to make pilgrimages to Olympia that consciously echoed the journeys of ancient Olympic pilgrims. These modern travelers came not to witness athletic competitions, but to experience the spiritual transformation that seemed to occur naturally in the presence of places where human excellence had been pursued with religious dedication. The excavated site became a living laboratory for understanding the relationship between physical environment and spiritual experience. Modern visitors often reported feeling the same sense of sacred presence that ancient sources had described, as if the spiritual power of the Olympic sanctuary had survived its physical destruction and waited patiently for human consciousness capable of recognizing and receiving it. The German archaeological team gradually came to understand that their work was more than scientific investigation. It was a form of resurrection magic that was returning to the world ideals and practices that human civilization desperately needed to rediscover. The Olympics they were uncovering had not been merely ancient athletic competitions, but comprehensive educational and spiritual systems that had developed human potential in ways that modern civilization had largely forgotten. The final irony of the Olympic resurrection was that the buried sanctuary proved to be in better condition than many buildings that had remained above ground throughout the intervening centuries. The earth that had seemed to destroy the Olympic site had actually protected it, preserving not just physical structures, but the spiritual atmosphere that had made those structures significant. The excavation revealed that some forms of death are actually hibernation. Some forms of ending are actually preservation. Some forms of forgetting are actually the gestation periods that precede more magnificent forms of remembering. By the time the major excavation phases were completed, the ancient Olympic sanctuary had emerged from the earth, not as a collection of historical ruins, but as a complete system for human development that offered solutions to problems that plagued modern civilization. The excavation had awakened more than ancient stones. It had awakened ancient wisdom that would prove essential for humanity's continued evolution toward its highest possibilities. The Olympic ideals that arose from the Greek earth were ready to be planted in modern soil, ready to grow into new forms that would honor their ancient origins while serving the needs of a world that had forgotten what competition could become when guided by the highest human values and the deepest spiritual insights. In 1896, just 21 years after Ernst Curtius first broke ground at ancient Olympia, the impossible became inevitable. The Olympic flame that had been extinguished by imperial decree 15 centuries earlier was rekindled in the same sacred grove where it had first burned in honor of Zeus, carried by priestesses dressed in ancient robes who understood that they were participating not in historical reenactment but in cosmic restoration. The circle that had been broken by time, neglect, and religious prohibition was closing once again, proving that some human achievements possess their own immortality, their own power to transcend the circumstances of their apparent destruction. The ceremony of rekindling took place in the ancient stadium, now cleared of the debris that had buried it for so many centuries. Modern pilgrims gathered where ancient spectators had once cheered for Coroebus and his successors, their faces bearing expressions of wonder that would have been familiar to any witness of the original Olympic Games. They had come not as tourists seeking entertainment, but as participants in a mystery that connected them directly to the deepest sources of human inspiration and divine approval. Baron Pierre de Coubertin stood among the olive trees of the sacred grove with tears streaming down his face, understanding that he had been privileged to witness something that transcended mere historical revival. He was observing the resurrection of human ideals that had seemed permanently lost but had proven instead to possess their own eternal life. The Olympic flame that rose from the ancient altar carried within its light the accumulated hopes and dreams of all who had ever believed that competition could serve purposes larger than individual ambition or tribal superiority. The priestess who kindled the sacred fire, using the same solar techniques that had been employed in ancient times, spoke words that echoed across the centuries. Apollo, god of light and sun, send thy rays and light the torch for the Olympic Games. The parabolic mirror caught the Greek sunlight and focused it into flame that seemed to bridge not just the distance between mirror and torch, but the gap between ancient and modern worlds, proving that some forms of human excellence exist outside the ordinary boundaries of historical time. As the flame caught and began to burn with the steady light that would soon travel to stadiums around the world, witnesses reported experiencing the same sense of divine presence that ancient sources had described. The rekindling was more than symbolic gesture, it was actual restoration of spiritual connection that had been interrupted but never completely severed. The gods who had once blessed Olympic competition with their attention seemed to be returning their gaze to mortal athletes who understood that their achievements could serve cosmic as well as personal purposes. The ceremony acknowledged both continuity and transformation. The modern Olympics would not be identical to their ancient predecessors. They would serve a world that had evolved far beyond anything the original Olympic organizers could have imagined. But the essential principles remained unchanged. Excellence pursued as a form of worship, competition undertaken as a means of human development, victory celebrated as proof of divine favor bestowed upon those who approached their contests with proper reverence and preparation. The flame that burned in the ancient brazier would soon travel to Athens, where the first modern Olympic Games would demonstrate that Olympic ideals could adapt to contemporary circumstances without losing their essential spiritual character. The athletes who gathered in 1896 understood that they were not merely reviving an ancient athletic festival, but proving that certain human values are truly eternal, that the pursuit of excellence transcends all historical and cultural boundaries. The modern Olympic movement that emerged from this rekindling would face challenges that the ancient games had never encountered: global rather than regional participation, political pressures that reflected international rather than merely local conflicts, commercial interests that threatened to transform sacred competition into secular entertainment. Yet the flame that burned in Olympia contained within its light the power to sanctify even these new complications, to transform them into opportunities for demonstrating that Olympic principles could serve the entire human family rather than just the Greek-speaking world. The Olympic motto that emerged from this resurrection, Citius, Altius, Fortius, faster, higher, stronger, captured the essential Olympic spirit while acknowledging its evolutionary potential. These were not merely athletic goals, but metaphysical aspirations that could be pursued in any field of human endeavor by anyone willing to approach excellence with the dedication and reverence that Olympic competition demanded. The motto promised not just better athletic performances, but better human beings, not just faster times, but deeper understanding of human potential. The return of the Olympics to their birthplace every 4 years for the lighting of the torch became a recurring miracle that reminded the world of the difference between ordinary competition and sacred contest. Each ceremony in the ancient grove refreshed the connection between modern athletes and the eternal principles that had motivated their ancient predecessors. The priestesses who tended the sacred fire served as living links between contemporary Olympic competitors and the spiritual traditions that gave their achievements their deepest meaning. The crowds that gathered to witness these ceremonies often included descendants of athletes who had competed in the ancient games, their presence creating genealogical as well as spiritual continuity between past and present Olympic traditions. These modern pilgrims understood that they were participating in something that transcended entertainment or even athletic achievement. They were witnessing the regular renewal of humanity's commitment to excellence as a form of spiritual practice. The ancient stadium, now restored to something approaching its original condition, served as a natural cathedral where the Olympic spirit could be experienced in its pure form, unmediated by the complexities and compromises that inevitably affected the modern games. Visitors who stood where ancient champions had achieved immortal glory often reported feeling the same sense of possibility that had motivated the first Olympic competitors. The understanding that human limitations exist primarily in imagination, and that divine favor rewards those who dare to attempt the impossible. The olive groves that surrounded the sacred precinct continued to produce the branches that would crown Olympic victors, creating physical continuity between ancient and modern achievement that no amount of technological progress could replace. The olive wreaths worn by contemporary Olympic champions carried within their living wood the same symbolic meaning they had possessed in ancient times. Recognition that true victory transcends temporal achievement to touch something eternal. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the Olympic return was the recognition that certain human experiences are truly archetypal. They repeat themselves across cultures and centuries because they touch fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend all historical and geographical boundaries. The Olympic Games had been restored not because modern civilization lacked adequate forms of athletic competition, but because humanity had unconsciously recognized its need for the particular synthesis of competition, spirituality, and international cooperation that only Olympic competition could provide. The eternal flame that burned in Olympia served as a constant reminder that the highest human achievements exist outside ordinary time, that excellence pursued with proper dedication creates its own immortality. Each rekindling of the Olympic flame renewed humanity's commitment to the belief that competition could serve transcendent purposes, that individual achievement could honor universal principles, that mortal striving could touch divine realms. Standing in the sacred grove where gods once walked among mortals, where the first Olympic Games had proven that human excellence could attract divine attention, where the eternal flame burned as testimony to the indestructible nature of human aspiration. Modern pilgrims understood that they were witnessing not the end of an ancient story, but its eternal continuation. The Olympic Games had returned home, and in returning, they had proven that some forms of human achievement exist outside the ordinary boundaries of birth and death, creation and destruction, memory and forgetting. The flame burned on, patient and eternal, waiting to kindle the dreams of athletes yet unborn, ready to sanctify competitions not yet imagined, prepared to prove once again that in the pursuit of excellence, mortals touch immortality, and the impossible reveals itself to be simply another name for the not yet accomplished. The Olympics had come home to stay, forever and always, in the realm where human dreams become divine. Truth and victory transforms both champion and witness into citizens of eternity.